The late afternoon sun filtered through the tall oaks outside, casting long shadows across the porch of Grace Montgomery's home. The house, nestled at the edge of Meridian Lake, had always been a quiet retreat, a place of solace after the whirlwind of raising her son, Ethan, and then losing him too soon. At 62, Grace had grown accustomed to the stillness of her world, the kind that settled deep in the bones after years of grief. She stood at the kitchen counter, preparing tea with practiced hands, the familiar scent of jasmine filling the room. Her mind, though, was far from the comforting ritual. Today, like every other, she found herself thinking about Ethan, the son she'd lost 6 months ago. She tried not to dwell on the pain, but sometimes, like now, it crept in, softly at first, then with a weight so heavy it threatened to collapse her chest. She missed him. Missed his laugh, the way he used to call her Mom, with that warm, familiar affection. The sound of tires crunching over gravel broke her from the haze of memories. She squinted through the kitchen window, barely able to make out the figure driving toward the house. It was Vanessa Harris, her daughter-in-law, Ethan's wife. Grace had never been able to fully warm to Vanessa. There was something about her, a kind of sharpness in the way she moved through the world that always felt off. Vanessa's car screeched to a halt just beyond the old oak tree at the edge of the lake, the tires spinning in a cloud of dust. Grace's heart skipped. She could see the frantic movements as Vanessa threw the car door open with more force than seemed necessary. The dress she wore, gray, the one Ethan had bought for her anniversary, was wrinkled, and her hair, usually so meticulously styled, hung in wild disarray. Grace's breath caught in her throat as she watched Vanessa rush to the trunk, her face twisted with a strange mix of panic and determination. Her movements were erratic, as if she were running from something, or perhaps towards something. There was no time to process the oddity of it. Vanessa yanked something from the trunk, something large and heavy, and with one swift motion, she swung a dark brown leather suitcase in the air. Grace's pulse quickened, her fingers gripping the edge of the counter. Vanessa's actions were almost mechanical, deliberate in their haste, but there was something wrong, something off about the whole scene. Grace watched as Vanessa took a few steps toward the lake, swinging the suitcase in a wild arc. And then, splash. The suitcase hit the water with an unmistakable thud. It sank quickly, as if the weight of whatever it held had been too much for the surface to bear. A chill ran down Grace Montgomery's spine. She couldn't breathe, couldn't think. The suitcase had barely sunk beneath the surface when she moved. Grace didn't even think. Her body, as though guided by instinct, bolted into action. She grabbed her sandals, nearly tripping over the porch steps as she rushed to the yard, her heart hammering in her chest. She could still see Vanessa, retreating back to her car in a hurried daze, not sparing a glance at the water. She slammed the car door shut, the tires squealing against the dirt road as she sped away, disappearing into the dust she left behind. But Grace didn't stop. She was already sprinting toward the lake, her legs aching as the sharp air bit at her lungs. Her mind spun with 1,000 questions. What could be in that suitcase? Why had Vanessa thrown it in? And why had it all felt so wrong? Her thoughts collided with each other as she reached the water's edge, her breath coming in short gasps. The suitcase was still there, bobbing just above the surface of the lake, its brown leather dark and heavy, weighed down by whatever it contained. She waded into the water, the coldness stinging her bare feet. The weight of the situation pressed on her chest as she stretched out her arms, her fingers barely brushing the suitcase's edge. She pulled. It was heavy, too heavy. She gritted her teeth, feeling the cold mud beneath her feet, but she didn't care. She pulled harder, her mind racing faster than her body. What could be inside? What was Vanessa hiding? The suitcase jerked in her hands, but she wouldn't stop. Not now. She wasn't sure why she felt so determined, but the need to uncover whatever secret was hiding in the water was like a magnet pulling at her very soul. Come on, come on. Her hands fumbled with the wet straps, and with a final effort, she yanked the suitcase from the water's grasp. It was drenched, its weight almost unbearable as she dragged it across the shore. A sound, a faint, muffled noise, came from inside. Something shifted inside her stomach, and the air seemed to freeze. Please, don't let it be what I think it is. Grace Montgomery took a trembling breath as she crouched beside the suitcase. her hands shaking violently as she reached for the zipper. Grace Montgomery's heart pounded in her chest as her feet hit the dirt road, the dry earth kicking up with every frantic step. Her breath came in sharp bursts, the air feeling heavier with each passing second. Her body was protesting, muscles stiff from the sudden sprint, yet her mind refused to let her stop. The weight of what she'd just witnessed, the suitcase sinking into the lake, the frantic look in Vanessa's eyes, drove her forward, pushing her through the exhaustion that threatened to pull her under. Her legs burned with the effort, a searing ache in her thighs and calves as they carried her across the yard, toward the shimmering lake in the distance. The world around her seemed to blur, the sound of her own pounding heart drowning out everything else. Grace could hardly focus on anything but the urgent need to reach the water's edge, to find out what lay within that suitcase. Her thoughts scrambled, each one crashing into the next, unable to make sense of the madness. Why had Vanessa done it? What was she hiding? Was the baby in that suitcase? 1,000 terrifying possibilities flashed through her mind, each one more dreadful than the last. The dry summer heat clung to her skin, beads of sweat trickling down her neck, but it was nothing compared to the cold chill settling deep in her stomach. Her breathing was shallow, and her chest felt tight, as if her body was trying to tell her to slow down, to think this through. But there was no time for that. Not now. Not with the weight of Vanessa's actions weighing so heavily on her, pulling her forward with a force she couldn't ignore. Keep running, she urged herself. You have to know, you have to see. The closer she got to the lake, the louder the world seemed to grow, her mind spiraling with fear and confusion. The lake, usually so peaceful and serene, felt like a battleground, a place where something terrible had already happened. Grace could see the water ahead, the ripples gently lapping at the shore. The suitcase, still afloat, drifted in the water like a grim reminder of the secret it held. It seemed to mock her, floating just out of reach, beckoning her to uncover what lay within. Her chest tightened further, a lump forming in her throat as she reached the shore. She could see it now, the suitcase, its dark leather soaked through, sitting in the water with an eerie stillness. For a moment, all she could do was stand there, breathless, staring at the floating object in front of her. The weight of what she was about to face, what she was about to uncover, seemed almost too much to bear. But she had no choice. She had to know. Grace Montgomery waded into the lake, the water biting at her ankles, sending a cold shiver up her spine. The chill of the water only heightened the urgency in her chest, her senses firing in every direction as she focused solely on the suitcase. The soft mud at the bottom of the lake sucked at her feet, making each step harder, each movement slower. But she pushed through it, determined to reach the suitcase, determined to get it out of the water. She reached out, hands shaking, her fingers brushing the cold, wet leather. The suitcase felt impossibly heavy in her grip, as though it were weighted with the secrets of the world. She pulled it toward her, the effort almost too much for her to bear. Her arms trembled with the strain, but she refused to stop. The muffled sound inside the suitcase, faint but unmistakable, sent a chill through her spine. It was there, beneath her hands, something alive, something fragile. What was it? Her thoughts raced. A baby? What could it be? With all the strength she could muster, Grace Montgomery yanked the suitcase toward the shore. It was a battle, her body trembling with exertion, the water splashing around her, but she didn't stop. She couldn't. Not now, not when every second felt like an eternity. Her chest tightened, her breathing shallow, but her hands gripped the suitcase with a fierce determination. The water grew shallower as she dragged the suitcase closer to the shore, and Grace could feel the weight of it in her arms, the wet leather dragging through the mud. She almost lost her footing, the slippery rocks beneath her threatening to send her into the water, but she regained her balance, her eyes locked on the suitcase. Please, please let it be nothing. But the muffled sound from inside only grew louder, sending a wave of terror through her body. With one final heave, Grace Montgomery pulled the suitcase onto the shore, her heart racing as she fell to her knees beside it. The world around her seemed to fade into nothingness as her hands fumbled at the zipper. It was stuck, wet, rusted from the lake's cold embrace. Her fingers slipped, desperate, trembling. She pressed her palms against the suitcase, willing it open, willing whatever was inside to be something less terrible than she feared. Come on, come on. With a sharp tug, the zipper burst open, the sound of it like a roar in the still air. Her hands trembled as she lifted the lid, her breath caught in her throat. What she saw inside made her heart stop. The moment Grace Montgomery opened the suitcase, everything around her seemed to vanish. The world fell silent, as if the very air had been sucked out of the space. There, cradled in a soaked, light blue blanket, lay a baby, so small, so fragile it barely seemed real. Grace's hands froze as she stared at the tiny figure, her heart stumbling in her chest. It couldn't be. It couldn't be happening. The baby's skin was pale, almost translucent, like wax left out in the sun for too long. His lips were a dull, unnatural purple. His chest didn't rise and fall with breath. It was still. Grace blinked, the scene blurring before her, her mind refusing to process what she was seeing. Her hands trembled violently as she reached out, her fingers brushing against his cold, damp skin. No, no, no. The thought kept repeating in her mind, as if saying it would make it true, that the baby was just asleep, just in a deep sleep. But the weight of him, so light, so unnervingly still, told her the truth she feared to face. She barely registered the tears that welled up in her eyes as her breath caught in her throat. The world had tilted into some nightmarish dream where nothing made sense, where she was trapped in a reality too dark to understand. The baby, her mind couldn't even form the words. He was a newborn, barely a few days old, and he was cold, too cold. Her breath hitched as she lifted the baby carefully, his small, delicate body fitting so easily in her trembling hands. His little head, soft and fragile, nestled in the palm of her hand as if it were the weight of a feather. The fragile umbilical cord hung loosely, tied off with a piece of plain string, a crude, desperate attempt at care, nothing like what it should have been. Grace's stomach twisted with dread, a sickening realization creeping over her like ice water. How could someone do this? The cold weight of the reality hit her like a punch to the gut. This child, this innocent, fragile thing had been discarded, left to die in the lake. Her arms shook as she pulled him closer, instinct driving her now, pushing her beyond fear. Her heart was in her throat, pounding so loudly she could barely hear anything else. Grace Montgomery pressed the baby's tiny body against her chest, her voice a strained whisper. "Please, please." She rocked him slightly, hopping for something, anything, that would prove he wasn't beyond saving. But nothing, no breath, no sound. In a panic, she shifted him in her arms, trying to clear the haze in her head. Think, think, think. Her hands fumbled as she tried to assess what to do, the helplessness pressing down on her like a heavy weight. The baby's skin was so cold against her. She needed to warm him. She needed to keep him alive. She cupped his tiny body against her chest with both hands now, her arms wrapped around him tightly, trying to transfer the warmth of her own body to him. The air felt thick, suffocating. Grace Montgomery was losing control, panic clawing at her, but somehow her hands remained steady. She walked backward, her feet slipping on the wet ground, all the while never letting go of the fragile bundle in her arms. Her legs wobbled beneath her, her mind screaming that she needed to get inside, needed to get the baby help. Come on, she thought desperately, her feet dragging her forward. The air was still, too still, the world around her forgotten as she focused on the weight in her arms. Grace Montgomery didn't know how long it took her to make it back to the house. It felt like hours, but it was probably only minutes. Every second was like an eternity. As she approached the porch, her heart pounding in her chest, she could already feel the weight of her own body dragging her down, but she had to keep going. She had to save him. The baby needed her. She couldn't fail him. The front door was wide open. Grace Montgomery stumbled inside, nearly tripping over the threshold, her breath ragged and desperate. She barely registered the coldness of the floor beneath her as she hurried to the kitchen. She needed warmth. She needed anything to revive this fragile child. Her mind raced, thinking of towels, blankets, anything that could help. With trembling hands, she reached for the nearest towel. The warmth of her home was the only comfort she could offer now. Grace Montgomery laid the towel carefully over the baby's small body, wrapping him up as best she could. The faint, almost imperceptible movements of his chest were the only signs that he was still fighting, still holding on. Then it happened. Grace Montgomery felt a flutter, so faint, so tiny that she almost thought she imagined it. But no, it was there. She felt a tiny breath. The air was moving, just the smallest hint of life. Her heart leapt in her chest, and for the first time since she found him, she let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. The baby was alive. Barely, but alive. Grace Montgomery cradled him close, her fingers brushing his cold skin gently, feeling the warmth slowly return to his fragile body. He's breathing. He's breathing. It was the smallest miracle, the faintest sign of hope, but it was enough. Grace Montgomery bent down and kissed the top of his head, her voice shaky but filled with determination. "You're going to be okay. I'm here. You're safe now." The weight of Grace Montgomery's hands on the baby felt like an anchor, her arms trembling as she cradled him against her chest. His skin, still cold but slightly warmer now, seemed to be fighting against the chill of the world around him. The faint rise and fall of his chest was the only sign that he might survive, but Grace knew that she couldn't do this alone. The baby needed more than what she could offer. Her heart was still hammering in her chest, but she forced herself to focus. Her fingers shook as she grabbed the phone on the counter. Her mind raced. 911. She needed to call 911. She needed help. But her hands were slick with sweat, the phone slipping once, twice, as her panic began to settle in her bones. Finally, she managed to dial. The phone seemed too loud in the quiet of the room, and for a moment she was afraid the operator wouldn't hear her. But the phone clicked, and a calm voice answered. 911, what's your emergency? Grace Montgomery could barely breathe as she spoke, her voice thin and sharp, like she was choking on each word. I found a baby, in the lake. He's cold. He's barely breathing. Please, please, I don't know what to do. She was hyperventilating now, the urgency in her voice growing as she felt the baby's fragile body against hers. His tiny hands, clutching the towel, shook, and every second seemed to stretch like 1,000 lifetimes. The operator's voice, calm yet commanding, pierced through Grace's panic. "Ma'am, I need you to stay calm. I'm going to guide you through this. First, lay the baby on a flat surface. Do you have a towel or blanket?" Grace barely heard the question. She did as instructed, laying the baby gently on the kitchen table, the cool surface making him shudder in her arms. She quickly grabbed a towel from the bathroom, its rough fabric contrasting with the baby's delicate skin. Her hands shook as she dried him, her motions frantic, but steady enough to follow the operator's instructions. "Cover him with the towel to keep him warm," the operator continued. "Check to see if he's breathing." Grace Montgomery pressed her ear to his tiny chest. The air was faint, almost imperceptible, but it was there, just a hint of breath, barely enough to give her hope. She pressed her hand to his chest, feeling his heartbeat, faint but steady. "I think he's breathing," Grace said, her voice barely above a whisper, unsure if she believed herself. "He's still so cold. What do I do?" The operator's calm voice continued, offering instructions that seemed to reach Grace through the fog of fear in her mind. "Keep him warm, wrap him tightly, and don't stop touching him. You need to keep him from going into shock." Grace followed every instruction, wrapping the baby as best she could, feeling his soft, fragile form in her arms. She rocked him gently, her heart swelling with desperation. She felt every second pass like an eternity, each minute dragging out as she tried to hold onto the sliver of hope that was barely hanging on by a thread. "Ma'am, the paramedics are on their way. Stay with him. Keep him warm. We're going to get him help. Can you tell me your address?" Grace struggled to steady her voice, her words coming out in broken sobs. "Yes, 163 Lakeside Drive. Please hurry." The seconds stretched into what felt like hours, but finally, through the haze of panic and confusion, she heard the sound she'd been waiting for, the sirens. A shrill wail that seemed to pierce through the thick air, filling the room with a rush of relief. The paramedics were close. She wasn't alone anymore. But even then, Grace Montgomery couldn't stop herself from glancing down at the tiny baby in her arms, his face still pale, his tiny chest still rising and falling with the faintest of breaths. She pressed him tighter against her chest, willing him to hold on, to fight. "You're not alone," she whispered softly, almost to herself. "I'm here." A knock on the door. The paramedics had arrived. She rushed to open it, her heart still racing, and two paramedics, One older man with a gray beard and a younger woman with dark hair tied back in a ponytail rushed in. They were quick, efficient, moving with practiced ease as they took the baby from Grace's arms. The older man's face softened when he saw the fragile child in his hands, but his eyes remained sharp. "We've got him," he said with authority, though Grace could see the concern in his gaze. He glanced up at her. "He's in good hands now." Grace Montgomery felt her knees weaken beneath her as the weight of the situation started to settle in. She was no longer the one holding the baby, but she couldn't shake the feeling of responsibility, of fear, and of the love she had already begun to feel for him. She had saved him, but there was so much more left to do. The woman paramedic placed the baby on a small gurney, adjusting his oxygen mask and attaching monitoring wires with swift movements. "He's cold. Severe hypothermia," the woman said, more to herself than anyone else. "But he's alive. We'll take care of him." Grace Montgomery stood back, allowing the paramedics to do their job, a sudden wave of exhaustion crashing over her as she collapsed onto the nearest chair. Her hands shook uncontrollably, and for the first time, she allowed herself to breathe. They were taking control now. The baby, Oliver Montgomery, was in safe hands. And for the first time since she had found him, Grace Montgomery allowed herself to feel something other than fear: relief. The sterile smell of antiseptic filled the air, a sharp contrast to the chaos of Grace Montgomery's mind. She sat in the uncomfortable plastic chair in the hospital waiting room, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, as if holding them still could steady the tremors that rattled through her body. Her eyes, red-rimmed and blurry from exhaustion, never left the door. Each minute that ticked by felt like an eternity, each second weighing heavier than the last. Grace Montgomery didn't know how long she'd been there. An hour. 2. The clock on the wall seemed to mock her, its ticking slow and deliberate, keeping time to the frantic rhythm of her heart. The adrenaline that had surged through her earlier had long since drained away, leaving behind an empty shell of a woman who was running on pure fear. Fear for the baby. No, Oliver Montgomery. She corrected herself in her mind. She had to start thinking of him as her grandson, but the fear didn't just stop there. Her grief for Ethan, her son, was an ever-present shadow that hovered over her every thought. His death had left a hole in her chest that no amount of time would ever fill, and now, the baby, his baby, was at death's door, clinging to life with the faintest breath. Grace Montgomery's thoughts spun in a dizzying circle. She couldn't quiet her mind. What if he doesn't make it? What if something goes wrong? She clenched her jaw, the weight of her helplessness pressing down on her chest. She hadn't been able to save her son. Could she save his son? Was this even her responsibility? And yet, the moment she had found him by the lake, held him in her arms, she had known without a doubt that she would do anything to protect him. Her fingers fidgeted, tapping nervously on her lap, until the soft click of the hospital door broke through the fog of her thoughts. Detective Sophie Martinez stepped into the room, her sharp eyes scanning the space before landing on Grace Montgomery. Behind her stood another officer, a younger man whose face was hard to read. They both looked at Grace, and for a split second, the weight of their gaze felt like another layer of pressure. "Mrs. Montgomery?" Detective Martinez asked, her voice steady but laced with a quiet urgency. She looked at Grace with an expression that could have been sympathy, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. "Yes," Grace's voice was thin, the words catching in her throat. "We need to ask you some questions about the baby," the detective continued, her tone polite but firm. "We need to understand what happened, how you found him, and what led up to it." Grace Montgomery nodded, the sense of being trapped in this moment pressing in on her. She didn't want to relive it. She didn't want to think about how she had sprinted to the lake, or how the suitcase had felt heavier than anything in the world, or the moment when she had opened it and seen the baby inside, so small and so fragile. But she had no choice. The questions would come, and she needed to answer. She opened her mouth, but the words stuck at first, the lump in her throat thickening with every breath. I don't know what happened. I saw Vanessa Harris throw the suitcase into the lake. I couldn't believe it at first. I didn't know what was inside. But then She stopped, her voice breaking, and she took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. "I ran to the water. I pulled him out. I didn't know if he was alive. I didn't know if I could save him, but he was breathing. Barely, just enough. I kept him warm, followed the 911 operator's instructions. That's all I did. I just tried to save him. Her words felt inadequate, like there was so much more she should have said, but the emotions threatened to choke her. Grace Montgomery fought against the tears that burned at the corners of her eyes. This was the baby's mother, right? She had tried to tell herself that maybe Vanessa had a reason. Maybe there had been some mistake, a break in her fragile mind from grief. But now, as the police stood before her, she couldn't deny it. Her own suspicion, her gut feeling that something was terribly wrong, pressed against her ribs like a vice. Detective Martinez was silent for a moment, taking notes on a small pad. Grace noticed the way the officer's eyes kept flicking to the side, as if weighing the words carefully. It made Grace uneasy. There was something in the air, a tension that hadn't been there before. She felt it crawling under her skin, spreading through her limbs like ice. The silence stretched until the officer looked up. "We've spoken to a few witnesses, people who live near the lake." She paused. Grace could feel her stomach tightening. "They saw Vanessa Harris leaving the scene," Detective Martinez continued, her voice soft but clear. "And we have reason to believe she was there much earlier than you described, before you even saw her at the lake." Grace Montgomery's breath caught. "What?" She stared at the detective, confusion and fear settling heavily in her chest. "What are you saying?" Grace whispered, her voice trembling. "No, it couldn't be, could it?" Detective Martinez didn't sugarcoat it. "We've received some conflicting reports, and we suspect that Vanessa Harris may be involved in more than just abandoning the baby. We're looking into her actions surrounding the baby's discovery. As of now, she is a prime suspect for attempted murder." The words hit Grace like a slap. Murder? She felt the floor tilt beneath her feet as if the ground had shifted, and suddenly the world she had been holding together, fragile, like a house of cards, had collapsed in an instant. Her thoughts spun. The shock, the disbelief, the gut-wrenching realization that the woman she had once accepted into her family, someone she had called a daughter, might be capable of something so horrific, something so unforgivable. It felt like the air had been sucked from the room. No, it can't be true. But as she stared into the detective's steady eyes, she realized it wasn't just a possibility anymore. The horror, the betrayal, it was all starting to sink in. Vanessa Harris wasn't just grieving. She wasn't just a widow lost in her own sorrow. No, there was something darker at play, something sinister beneath the surface of the woman who had seemed so perfect, so in control. Grace Montgomery felt her stomach twist, the weight of everything crashing down on her all at once. Detective Martinez watched her carefully, waiting for the shock to settle. "I know this is a lot to process, Mrs. Montgomery, but we need your help. The more we understand about Vanessa, the faster we can get to the truth." Grace Montgomery nodded slowly, but her mind was already spiraling. She had saved the baby. She had brought him into safety. But now, as she faced the overwhelming weight of Vanessa's actions and the police's growing suspicion, Grace knew that the real battle had only just begun. The waiting room felt colder than it had moments ago. Grace Montgomery sat in the stiff plastic chair, her hands folded tightly in her lap, eyes locked on the sterile floor beneath her. The fluorescent lights above buzzed softly, a constant, oppressive hum that only amplified the silence pressing in on her. Every second felt like an eternity, the room's dullness an unbearable contrast to the whirlwind of emotions spinning inside her. She couldn't stop thinking about the baby. Oliver Montgomery, she reminded herself again, though the name still felt foreign on her tongue. Her mind kept flashing back to the moment she'd first pulled him from the water, the sheer weight of the shock still settling on her heart. A baby, her grandson, her son's child, Ethan's child, had been discarded, left to die. She still couldn't understand it. How could Vanessa Harris, her daughter-in-law, have done this? The DNA test had been run. The results were in. She couldn't ignore the knot tightening in her stomach, the pit of dread that had been growing for the past few hours. What if they told her something she didn't want to hear? What if? No, she couldn't go there. She couldn't afford to think about the worst-case scenario. But as the minutes ticked by, Grace Montgomery could feel the weight of her uncertainty pressing down on her chest, making it harder to breathe. The door to the waiting room opened. Detective Sophie Martinez stepped inside, her face unreadable, but her eyes were sharp. She held a folder, one that seemed impossibly heavy in Grace's line of sight. It felt like everything in the world had paused, as though she was suspended in this moment, about to be handed a truth she wasn't ready for. "Mrs. Montgomery," the detective began, her voice steady but laced with an undercurrent of something. "Final. The DNA test results are in. We've confirmed that the baby you found, Oliver Montgomery, is your biological grandson." For a moment, the words didn't quite register. Grace blinked, her vision blurring as if the room itself was spinning, trying to process what she had just heard. Her grandson? No, that couldn't be right. Her son, Ethan, had been gone for 6 months. She buried him. There had been no sign of a pregnancy, no hint that Vanessa had been carrying a child. How could this be possible? Her heart seemed to stop for a fraction of a second, and then it hammered painfully in her chest, each beat almost too loud in the overwhelming silence. Her breath hitched, and she stood up abruptly, nearly knocking over the chair. Her legs felt weak beneath her as she struggled to stay steady, her mind a blur of conflicting thoughts. This makes no sense. She thought she had understood the situation, that the baby had somehow slipped through the cracks of Vanessa's grief, but this changed everything. "Wait," Grace croaked, the words coming out ragged and disbelieving. She swallowed hard, trying to make sense of what was happening. "You're sure? This baby Oliver, he's really Ethan's son?" Detective Martinez nodded slowly, her gaze sympathetic yet firm. "Yes, ma'am. We ran the test twice, just to be certain. The baby shares approximately 25% of his DNA with you. He's your biological grandson." The words hung in the air like a storm cloud, and for a moment, Grace Montgomery could only stand there, trembling with the weight of it. Her grandson. But that meant Ethan had a son. He had a child he never knew about, a child Vanessa had kept hidden, a child Grace had never suspected existed. Her son had died, never knowing he had a son, a child who was now lying in a hospital crib, fighting for his life. The grief for Ethan hit her like a wave, the sharp, jagged pain of his loss surging through her all over again. She had already buried him. She had already said goodbye. And now this discovery of a grandson, this baby who might be the only part of Ethan left, was suddenly her responsibility. The emotions tangled inside her, love, grief, fear, all battling for dominance. She wanted to protect him. She wanted to shield him from the world, from whatever terrible things had led him to be abandoned in a lake. But she didn't know how. She had never been prepared for this. Her chest tightened as a wave of protectiveness washed over her, something primal and raw. Oliver Montgomery, this fragile, tiny child, was now her responsibility. It didn't matter that she was 62 years old or that her life had already been shattered by the loss of her son. Oliver was family. He was the only piece of Ethan she had left, and she would fight for him, no matter what. Her fingers clenched into fists at her sides, the reality of it all sinking in. She didn't care about the exhaustion, the fear, or the uncertainty that lay ahead. She would not fail him, just as she hadn't failed Ethan when she held him as a baby, or when she tried her best to raise him. But the mystery around Vanessa Harris only deepened. How could the woman she had once welcomed into her family be capable of something so heinous? Had she known all along that she was pregnant? Had Ethan known about it? Was this baby part of some twisted secret that Vanessa had been hiding all along? Her thoughts swirled like a storm, and as much as she wanted to focus on the love she already felt for Oliver, she couldn't shake the feeling that Vanessa was hiding something darker. The woman who had cried at Ethan's funeral as if she had lost her soul. Had she really been mourning? Or was there something more sinister at play? Grace Montgomery felt the weight of the situation press down on her, the storm of emotions swirling in her chest. She was faced with the impossible, a life she hadn't planned for, a new responsibility she hadn't asked for, and a mystery that was only growing darker by the second. As much as she wanted to wrap Oliver in her arms and keep him safe forever, the question remained, what had happened to him? And why had Vanessa tried to kill him? The hospital room was too quiet for Grace Montgomery. The hum of the machines monitoring Oliver Montgomery's fragile heartbeats, the soft shuffle of the nurse's shoes as she moved around the room, these sounds seemed to echo in Grace's ears, amplifying the gnawing uncertainty in her chest. Oliver was stable now, his breathing steady but still shallow, the flicker of life in his tiny form a miracle. But the victory of that moment, the relief that had washed over Grace when she saw the baby breathe again, was slipping away, replaced by a cold, tightening knot in her stomach. The weight of what had happened was settling in, and it felt unbearable. Vanessa Harris, the woman who had been Ethan Montgomery's wife, who had once been part of Grace's family, had vanished. Completely. The police had been on her trail for days now, but there was still no sign of her. The search, though urgent, seemed futile. The world felt suddenly smaller, suffocating, as Grace Montgomery tried to reconcile the Vanessa she had known with the woman now suspected of abandoning a baby and possibly trying to murder him. Vanessa Harris, once a polished, well-manicured presence in Grace's life, now seemed like a stranger, someone whose image had been distorted by the horrors of the truth. How could this woman who had seemed so composed, so seemingly devoted to Ethan, be capable of such cruelty? Grace could still picture her, the way Vanessa would smile politely, the way she had dressed so impeccably at family gatherings. She had always been reserved but never alarming. In all the years she had spent with Ethan, Grace had never seen anything in her behavior that hinted at the darkness that now seemed to consume her. But now the police were certain. Vanessa was a suspect in multiple crimes, attempted murder, child endangerment, and even possible involvement in Ethan's death. Grace Montgomery felt her blood run cold every time the words were spoken aloud. The woman who had once been her daughter-in-law, whom she had trusted, even if only in a superficial way, was now the face of betrayal, the person who had failed to protect her own child. The woman who had left Oliver to die. Detective Sophie Martinez had been the one to break the news. Her face had been tight with concern when she told Grace that Vanessa Harris's car was gone, her apartment was empty, and her phone had been turned off. The police had tracked her to a supermarket parking lot 2 days after the incident, but after that, there had been nothing, not a trace. Vanessa had disappeared as if she had never existed. The officer had been quick to point out that Vanessa was now the prime suspect in Ethan's death. Her involvement in his car accident wasn't a coincidence. But Grace Montgomery wasn't ready to believe that Vanessa could be so cold, so calculating. It didn't fit with the image of her she had carried all these years. Grace sat by Oliver's bed, her hands resting gently on the edge of the crib, but her mind was elsewhere. Every detail about Vanessa, every memory of her, now felt tainted. The things Grace had once overlooked in the young woman, the odd way she would smile a little too thinly, her stiff politeness, the way she never seemed to care much for family holidays, had all taken on new meaning. Vanessa Harris wasn't just grieving the loss of her husband. She wasn't just trying to cope. No, this was something darker, something much darker. Grace couldn't help but replay the phone call she had overheard, the one between Vanessa and Carlos Medina, the mechanic who had tampered with Ethan's car. That cold, controlled voice on the other end of the line. She had been so sure of herself, so certain in her manipulations. The words Grace had overheard, the accusations against her son, the threats she'd made, had left a mark on her soul. What had driven Vanessa to this point? What had pushed her to throw her own child into the lake? Was it really about money? Grace Montgomery could see the image of Vanessa standing there by the water's edge, looking back at the suitcase with a cold detachment, her movements almost mechanical. What had she been thinking in that moment? Was she just trying to get rid of the evidence of her past? Was Oliver a reminder of everything she had lost, everything she hadn't wanted? Grace Montgomery was still grappling with the complexity of it all when the door to the room opened. Detective Martinez stepped inside again, her eyes hard with determination but tempered with exhaustion. "Mrs. Montgomery," she began, her voice clipped, as if she had been running on fumes for far too long. "We've got a lead." Grace's heart leapt. "What is it?" "The last place Vanessa was seen. It's been traced to a small town near the state border. We're sending officers there now. There's a chance she might be hiding out with someone, but as of now, she's off the grid. We still don't know how she's been getting by." The detective paused, her expression unreadable. "We need your help, Mrs. Montgomery. Anything you can think of, anything at all. Did she ever mention a friend or family member who might take her in?" Grace thought hard. She had no idea where Vanessa could have gone, but then a small memory flickered to life. There's her aunt. Ethan mentioned her once. He said Vanessa had an aunt who lived up north near the border. I don't remember much about her, but I think Vanessa used to talk about her before they got married." The detective jotted down the information. "That's something," she said, her voice tinged with hope. "We'll look into it. We'll follow up with every lead. Don't worry, Mrs. Montgomery, we'll find her." But even as she said those words, Grace Montgomery felt a creeping doubt take root in her heart. What if they couldn't find Vanessa? What if she was already too far gone, slipping through their fingers? And even if they did find her, what would happen then? What would she say when they finally confronted her? Her thoughts turned to Oliver, lying still in the hospital bed. Her protective instincts flared. The thought of Vanessa still being out there, still a threat, made Grace's blood run cold. She could never let that woman get near Oliver again. No matter what it took, Grace Montgomery would protect him with everything she had left. The days in the hospital seemed to blur together, a haze of uncertainty and fear that wrapped itself tightly around Grace Montgomery like a suffocating blanket. Oliver Montgomery, her grandson, lay in the neonatal intensive care unit, still fighting for his life, each breath a fragile testament to his resilience. But with every passing hour, the weight of the world seemed to press down harder on Grace's shoulders. She found herself wandering the hospital halls, lost in her thoughts, unsure of what to do or where to turn. The walls seemed to close in on her, the sterile white of the hospital room echoing the emptiness she felt inside. She missed her son Ethan more than she could put into words. His absence, so final, so irreversible, still cut through her like a knife. And now, with Oliver's future hanging in the balance, she felt like she was being pulled in every direction, forced to make decisions that she wasn't prepared for. It was in the midst of all this turmoil that Father Michael Davis entered her life again. Father Michael had been a quiet, steady presence in Grace's life for as long as she could remember. He had married her and Ethan, blessed their home, and always been there when life seemed to throw its worst at them. He was a kind man, soft-spoken and patient, with an understanding that seemed almost divine. And now, as her world fell apart, he had come to offer his support once again. He had arrived at the hospital that morning, just as Grace was leaving Oliver's room, the exhaustion on her face a clear indicator of the toll the past few days had taken. Without a word, he reached out and gently placed a hand on her shoulder, his presence soothing her like a balm to a wound she didn't even realize was still raw. "Grace," he said softly, his voice a comforting whisper in the sterile hallway. "How are you holding up?" Grace felt her chest tighten at the question, the tears threatening to spill. She hadn't realized how much she had needed someone to ask. For days now, she had been fighting her own grief, fear, and confusion, not allowing herself the space to break. But now, with Father Michael's simple question, she felt herself unraveling. "I don't know how to do this," she admitted, her voice cracking as she turned to face him. Her eyes welled with tears and she fought to keep them back. "I don't know how to keep going. Oliver is barely hanging on and she choked on her words. "I don't know if I can handle this. I'm scared. I don't know what to do. What if something happens to him?" Father Michael looked at her with kindness, a deep understanding in his gaze. He had seen pain, loss, and suffering in his years as a priest, but there was something about Grace Montgomery's struggle that hit him deeply. She wasn't just grieving a son. She was trying to carry a legacy of love and protectiveness for a child she had just met, a child she had barely begun to know. The weight of that responsibility was immense. "You're not alone in this, Grace," Father Michael said quietly, his voice a gentle reassurance. "You have strength, even if you can't see it right now. It's in your love for Ethan, in your willingness to fight for Oliver. That's a gift, one that not everyone has." Grace wiped her eyes, feeling both comforted and unsettled by his words. "But I don't feel strong. I feel lost. I feel like I've failed already. I should have done something sooner. I should have." She stopped herself, her thoughts spiraling again, and shook her head. "I don't know how to protect him from Vanessa. How can I protect him if she's out there? What if she tries to come back? What if she? Father Michael placed a hand gently on her arm, his touch grounding her, steadying her. "Grace, you can't carry this burden alone. Not everything is within your control. There are forces at work here that you may not understand yet, but I promise you, you will not be left alone in this." He stepped back slightly, his eyes softening as he studied her. Remember, Grace, God's love is with you. It's been with you through all the pain, through all the grief. It's here now in this moment in your willingness to care for Oliver. This child, he is a gift, a second chance, and he is in your care for a reason. Grace Montgomery closed her eyes, the ache in her chest throbbing with the weight of his words. She wanted to believe him. She wanted to feel the peace that he was offering, but the fear and uncertainty were so overwhelming. How could she protect Oliver when she didn't even know where to begin? "Father," she said after a long silence, her voice still trembling, "I'm not sure I'm strong enough." Father Michael smiled softly, his eyes filled with compassion. "None of us are strong enough on our own, Grace, but together, with faith and with love, we can move mountains." For a moment, Grace didn't speak. His words, though simple, had found their way into her heart. She didn't know if she believed in divine intervention, but she could feel Father Michael's faith, the quiet confidence in his words. It offered her something she hadn't had in days, hope. And that was enough. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Father Michael gave her a nod, a quiet acknowledgement. He knew the road ahead would be long, that there were still many questions to answer. But in that moment, in the shared silence between them, Grace Montgomery felt the first hint of peace she had since she had pulled Oliver from the lake. Father Michael was right. She wasn't alone. And for the first time in days, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, she could find the strength to protect Oliver, to be the grandmother he needed, and to face whatever came next. The walls of the courtroom felt too close, as if they were closing in on Grace Montgomery with every passing second. The crisp, formal air hung heavy around her, filled with the murmur of lawyers, the shuffle of papers, and the soft tapping of the judge's gavel. Grace sat in the wooden chair, her hands trembling in her lap, trying to steady the nervousness that gripped her chest. Today was the day she would fight for Oliver Montgomery, her grandson, her second chance. But with every moment, the fear that she wasn't enough, that she couldn't do this, threatened to swallow her whole. She had spent the past weeks preparing for this, gathering documents, meeting with social workers, filling out forms, and attending countless evaluations. But none of it felt real until now, in the quiet but charged atmosphere of the courtroom. The long hours of waiting, of uncertain hope, were now boiling down to this one moment. She was about to stand before the judge and argue her case for temporary custody of Oliver. But was it enough? Could she convince the court that she was fit, that she was strong enough, to take care of this tiny life that had been thrust upon her? Her thoughts raced. What if they say no? What if they decide that I'm too old, too unstable, too unprepared to raise him? What if they send him to foster care? The possibilities felt endless, and none of them ended the way she wanted. Beside her sat Father Michael Davis, his presence a comforting anchor in the chaos of her mind. He hadn't left her side since she had arrived at the courthouse this morning. He offered her a soft smile, his hand resting lightly on her shoulder. "You've done everything you can, Grace," he whispered. "You've fought for him every step of the way. You've given him love. That's what matters." She nodded, grateful for his words, though they couldn't completely calm the storm in her heart. Grace Montgomery's eyes flickered nervously toward the judge's bench. The judge, a stern woman with short gray hair and glasses perched at the tip of her nose, sat behind a thick stack of papers, her gaze flitting over the files in front of her. She was unyielding, calculating, and precise. Everything in this room, every word, would be scrutinized. Grace's fate and Oliver's was in her hands now. The moment the court session began, Grace Montgomery felt her body stiffen. Vanessa Harris was not present. Her absence hung in the air, an unspoken accusation that seemed to underline the entire case. Grace had never imagined that the woman who had once been part of her family would become the very person responsible for throwing the baby into the lake, for tearing apart the fragile fabric of their lives. She had never thought it would come to this. And yet, here she was, fighting to protect Oliver from the very person who should have been protecting him. "Mrs. Montgomery," the judge called, her voice cutting through the silence, "please approach the stand." With a final glance at Father Michael, Grace Montgomery stood, her knees shaking slightly beneath her. She walked to the stand, feeling the weight of every pair of eyes on her. She could feel the subtle pressure of the judge's gaze, watching, waiting, assessing. She tried to steady her breath, trying to push the wave of panic down. She had practiced what to say, but now, in the face of such overwhelming judgment, the words felt as if they had escaped her. I'm here today to petition for temporary custody of my grandson, Oliver Montgomery, Grace began, her voice wavering slightly, but she forced herself to look the judge in the eye. He's only a baby and he's been through so much already. I know I'm not the perfect candidate. I'm 62 years old. I've lost my son and I've been through a lot of grief, but I promise you I will do whatever it takes to raise him. I will give him love. I will give him safety. I will be the family he needs. Her words hung in the air, but Grace Montgomery felt as though they weren't enough. She wasn't enough. She wasn't sure if anyone in this room understood the depth of her determination, how far she would go to protect this baby. Her hands clenched into fists as she continued, the weight of her words pressing down on her. I'm not asking for a lot, she said, her voice thick with emotion. I just want him to be safe. I just want him to know love. I will provide for him. I will be there for him. Please, please give me the chance to do that. The judge's eyes never wavered as she took notes, her pen scratching across the paper. Grace Montgomery swallowed hard, waiting for the verdict, her heart pounding in her chest. The silence that followed felt endless. Grace couldn't tell if the judge was sympathetic or skeptical. It was like standing at the edge of a precipice, waiting for the fall. The defense attorney, who had remained silent until now, stood to make his argument. He was young, well-dressed, his face polished with professionalism. He approached the judge, and the tension in the room thickened. Grace could feel every word, every breath, becoming more and more difficult to hold. Your Honor, we must consider the fact that Mrs. Montgomery has had a significant amount of grief and trauma in her life recently, the defense attorney said smoothly, his eyes scanning the room. Her advanced age may limit her ability to provide the care that a newborn requires. Oliver Montgomery would be better placed in a certified foster home, where professionals can ensure that his needs are met. Grace Montgomery felt the sting of his words, a sharp needle of doubt pricking at her heart. Could she really do this? Could she really raise a child at this age, after all she had been through? She looked down at her hands, clenched tightly in her lap, as the weight of the moment threatened to suffocate her. The judge, however, did not appear convinced by the defense's argument. She sat back, steepling her fingers, and then, after a long moment of silence, she spoke. I have reviewed the case carefully, she said, her voice calm but firm. Mrs. Montgomery's situation is unusual, and I do not take this decision lightly. However, what is clear to me is that this child is already bonded with his grandmother. His survival, his very presence here today, is a testament to Grace Montgomery's love and determination. Grace Montgomery held her breath as the judge continued. I am granting temporary custody of Oliver Montgomery to Mrs. Montgomery, effective immediately. However, there will be ongoing evaluations, and this case will be revisited in 6 months to ensure that the child's best interests are being met. The words hit her like a wave. Grace Montgomery felt the floor beneath her sway, her body trembling as the tears she had been holding back finally spilled over. She closed her eyes, barely able to control the sobs that racked her body. She had done it. She had won, for now. She turned toward Father Michael, who was already standing, his face filled with quiet relief. His hand rested on her shoulder as he whispered, You did it. He's safe. Tears flowed freely down Grace Montgomery's face as she felt the weight of it all lift, if only for a moment. Oliver Montgomery was safe for now. He was going to be okay. The tension in Grace Montgomery's chest had only grown since the court hearing. Oliver Montgomery was now safe, under her care, and her fight to keep him had begun to feel like a win, albeit a small one. She had started to allow herself the hope that maybe, just maybe, things would begin to settle. But as the days passed, a cold knot of uncertainty lingered in her stomach, an unshakable feeling that the darkness was far from over. It wasn't until a phone call came late one evening that everything she thought she knew, about Vanessa Harris, about Ethan Montgomery, and about the tragic accident, shattered in an instant. Grace, it's Detective Martinez. The voice on the other end of the line was urgent, professional, but tinged with something that made Grace sit up straighter, her heart suddenly racing. We've uncovered something new, something we need you to know. The detective's words felt like a heavy weight dropping onto Grace's chest. "What is it?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Vanessa Harris didn't just leave Oliver to die in that lake," Detective Martinez continued, her voice grim. "She had a hand in Ethan's death. We've traced the events leading up to the accident, and it's not what we thought." Grace Montgomery's breath hitched in her throat. "What do you mean?" Her voice trembled, confusion, fear, and disbelief flooding through her. "We've found evidence that the brakes on Ethan's car were tampered with. They were deliberately sabotaged." The words hung in the air, sharp and cruel, like a slap across Grace's face. "We believe that Vanessa was involved in orchestrating it." The phone slipped from Grace Montgomery's hand, her body suddenly feeling weak, her vision blurring. She had to sit down, her legs giving way beneath her. She hadn't heard the full weight of the detective's words yet, but they had already landed on her like a storm, and she couldn't make sense of what she had just heard. Vanessa, her daughter-in-law, the woman who had been by her son's side in his final moments. The woman who had pretended to grieve, who had stood beside her in the funeral home, her face a mask of sorrow. And now, Grace Montgomery was hearing this. Ethan Montgomery's death, an accident, a tragic rainy night where his car had skidded off the road and crashed into a tree, was no accident. It had been orchestrated. Vanessa had killed her own husband. "Grace," the detective's voice cut through the haze of disbelief in Grace's mind. "We've also spoken to a mechanic, Carlos Medina," he confessed. He admitted that Vanessa paid him to tamper with Ethan's car to disable the brakes. The world around Grace Montgomery seemed to vanish. She felt as if the floor had disappeared beneath her, leaving her suspended in an abyss of confusion and pain. She pressed her hands to her face, trying to block out the images flooding into her mind. Vanessa Harris, the woman who had once been part of their family, had murdered Ethan. She had killed the man she had loved, the man who had loved her, all for money, for control, for something she could never have unless she took Ethan out of the equation. The fury began to build inside her, a slow burn at first, then an inferno of anger and betrayal that twisted her stomach. How dare she? How dare Vanessa play the role of a grieving widow, pretending to mourn the loss of a man she had murdered? And for what? A life insurance policy? Money that wasn't even hers. She had killed Ethan to get her hands on it all. Why would she do this? Grace's voice cracked, her words coming out in a strained whisper. The detective's silence on the other end of the line only confirmed her worst fear, that there was no clear answer, no reason that could explain the monstrous things Vanessa had done. The detective continued, "We've reviewed Vanessa's phone records and found that Carlos Medina was paid 2 weeks before the accident. The payment wasn't even subtle, it was made directly to his bank account. Vanessa wanted Ethan out of the way. She wasn't just after the life insurance money. We believe she wanted him gone before Oliver was born. She didn't want to be tied down. And she certainly didn't want the responsibility of a child, especially not with Ethan's fortune at stake." Grace Montgomery felt sick. The betrayal was so deep, so vicious, that it felt like it was consuming her from the inside out. Her own son had been murdered by the woman he had loved. The woman who had stood by his side, the woman he had trusted, the woman who had promised to build a life with him. And now, in the cruelest twist of fate, Grace was left to pick up the pieces. Her heart clenched as she thought of the last months of Ethan's life. His sudden distance, his unease, his warning signs that she had dismissed as nothing more than stress. But now she understood. Ethan had known. He had suspected something was wrong with Vanessa, and it had cost him his life. Tears blurred Grace Montgomery's vision. She squeezed her eyes shut, as if trying to block out the pain of it all. The realization that Vanessa had deliberately sabotaged Ethan's life, that she had been the architect of his death, overwhelmed her. "I don't know how to go on," Grace whispered, her voice breaking. "I don't know how to face this. How could I have been so blind?" The detective's voice softened. "You couldn't have known, Grace. No one could have. Vanessa is good at hiding her true nature, but the truth is out now, and we're going to bring her to justice. We won't stop until we find her." But even as the detective spoke, Grace Montgomery felt the growing realization that it didn't matter how much justice was served. Ethan was gone. Her son would never walk through the door again, never hold Oliver in his arms. And Vanessa? She was still out there, a fugitive, a woman who had taken everything from Grace. Her son, her peace, her future. The anger inside Grace burned brighter now. She would make sure that Vanessa paid for what she had done, not just to Ethan, but to Oliver too. Grace Montgomery would make sure of it. The house was eerily quiet. Grace Montgomery sat in the dimly lit living room, her eyes fixed on Oliver Montgomery as he slept peacefully in his crib. The soft rise and fall of his tiny chest was a gentle reminder that he was still here, still fighting, still alive against all odds. The calmness of the moment seemed to mock the storm of fear and uncertainty swirling inside Grace's heart. It had been weeks since she'd discovered the truth about Vanessa Harris. Weeks since she had learned that the woman who had once been part of her family was capable of such unimaginable cruelty. But despite the police's ongoing search, despite the mounting evidence against Vanessa, there was no sense of relief. If anything, the fear only deepened. Vanessa was still out there, somewhere, lurking in the shadows. Grace couldn't shake the feeling that it was only a matter of time before Vanessa made her next move. It was late when the phone rang. The sharp, shrill sound broke the silence and Grace flinched, her heart instantly racing. She glanced at the caller ID. No name, just an unknown number. For a moment, she hesitated. The sound of Oliver's soft breathing filled the room, but Grace couldn't shake the fear that gripped her chest. With trembling hands, she answered, "Hello." There was a long pause, a breathless silence on the other end of the line. And then a voice one Grace Montgomery would never forget. Cold, empty, Vanessa's voice. "You're still protecting him, aren't you?" Vanessa's words came slowly, deliberately, as if savoring the moment. "Oliver Montgomery, my son, you think you can keep him from me?" Grace's stomach twisted, a jolt of panic shooting through her. The words felt like a slap to her already fragile state, each one a bitter reminder of the threat Vanessa posed. She swallowed hard, trying to steady her breath. "Vanessa," she began, her voice shaking with a mix of fear and resolve. "You need to stop this. You can't have him. Oliver is my grandson, and I'm not going to let you hurt him." A low, humorless chuckle came from the other end of the line. Vanessa was enjoying this. The control she had over Grace was palpable. "You don't get it, do you? You think you can keep him, but you're wrong. You're too old. You're not fit. I'm his mother, Grace. I get to decide what happens to him." Her voice dropped to a deadly whisper. "And I want him back. Now." Grace felt her heart beat faster, the blood rushing in her ears. The tension in her chest was suffocating. "You tried to kill him," Grace spat, her words coming out in a rush, full of rage and disbelief. "You threw him in that lake. You almost killed him, and now you want him back. What kind of mother are you?" There was silence on the line. A chill ran down Grace Montgomery's spine, her mind racing. Vanessa didn't respond at first. When she finally spoke again, her voice was colder, more controlled, as if she had been savoring the moment of Grace's outrage. "You don't know what I'm capable of, do you?" Vanessa's words were ice, sharp and cutting. "I'm not asking for your permission. You can't stop me. You can't protect him. If you want him alive, you'll give him back to me, and you'll do it tonight." There was a pause. Vanessa's next words made Grace's blood run cold. "Meet me at the warehouse by the lake at midnight. Come alone. If you bring anyone, I'll disappear and you'll never see him again. I'll make sure of it." The phone went silent for a moment, and Grace could feel her pulse pounding in her throat, the weight of the threat sinking in. She squeezed the phone tighter, the reality of what Vanessa was capable of setting in like a stone lodged in her chest. Oliver was in danger. He was her only focus now. The fear that had haunted her since Vanessa first disappeared had now turned into a clear and present danger. "What do you want?" Grace asked, her voice shaking with barely restrained terror. "I want Oliver," Vanessa replied coldly. "And if you want him to stay alive, you'll do exactly as I say." Grace felt a surge of determination. She wasn't about to let Vanessa win. No matter how much fear gnawed at her insides, no matter how dangerous Vanessa might be, Grace Montgomery had come this far for Oliver. She would protect him at any cost. "I'll be there," Grace said, her voice now steady, firm, resolute. "But you're not getting away with this, Vanessa. The police are already on your trail. They'll find you, and when they do, you'll pay for what you've done." Vanessa's laughter was soft and chilling, like the sound of nails dragging across a chalkboard. "You think you're the one in control here, don't you? I have everything planned out, Grace. You're just a pawn in this game. I will get my son back, and there's nothing you can do to stop me." And with that, the line went dead. Grace Montgomery stood in the center of the room, the phone still pressed to her ear, her heart pounding in her chest. The reality of what she had just heard slammed into her with full force. Vanessa wasn't done. She hadn't stopped, and now she was coming for Oliver again. Her mind raced, her thoughts colliding in a frantic whirlwind. Grace knew that Vanessa was dangerous, but now she was desperate, and desperate people did reckless things. Grace had to act fast. She wasn't going to give Vanessa the chance to take Oliver from her. Before she could even process her fear, she was already dialing the police. She couldn't handle this alone. She had to trust them. She had to set a trap. The hours before midnight stretched on endlessly. Grace Montgomery had spent the day in a haze of preparation, her mind racing with the looming confrontation that would decide everything. Every step had been carefully planned by the police, every detail scrutinized, but none of it made the fear in her chest subside. She had been through so much: loss, betrayal, and heartbreak, but nothing had ever felt as heavy as the decision to walk into that warehouse alone. She stood now in the dimly lit hallway of her home, her fingers trembling as she adjusted the collar of her jacket. Oliver Montgomery was with Alois, safe and far from the dangers that Vanessa Harris represented. But as Grace gazed at the empty crib, the quiet house felt like an oppressive weight on her shoulders. She was about to face the woman who had shattered everything she had worked so hard to protect, the woman who had not only murdered her son, but had tried to kill Oliver as well. Stay calm, she reminded herself, but the tension in her chest was suffocating, her nerves dancing with anxiety and fear. The police had insisted that Grace remain in the shadows, to let them take control once Vanessa revealed herself. But that didn't make her feel any safer. She was walking into the lion's den. And she couldn't shake the image of Vanessa's cold, calculating face, the woman who had once been family and now was a threat to everything Grace held dear. Her phone buzzed, a message from Detective Martinez confirming that the police were in position. Everything was set. It was time. The trap was ready. With a deep, steadying breath, Grace Montgomery drove to the warehouse, her grip on the steering wheel tightening with every mile. The wind outside howled through the trees, a constant reminder of the danger closing in. By the time she arrived at the abandoned warehouse by the lake, her heart was pounding in her ears. The place looked the same as it always had, dilapidated, dark, and forgotten. But tonight, it felt alive with tension, each shadow, each creaking floorboard, filled with menace. Grace stepped out of the car, her feet dragging as she made her way toward the warehouse. The headlights from her car cut through the darkness, but there was no sign of Vanessa yet. She swallowed the lump in her throat, her breath shallow, as she approached the rusted metal doors. The sound of her footsteps echoed in the still night air, amplifying her every movement, every breath. Inside, she knew the police were watching, hidden, waiting for the right moment to spring into action. She was alone, just as Vanessa had ordered, but every step she took felt like a step closer to the unknown. Her heart hammered in her chest, each beat echoing in the silence. When she reached the door, she paused, taking a deep breath. "You're doing this for Oliver," she reminded herself, "for him." She pushed open the door with a creak that seemed to echo through the entire warehouse. Her eyes scanned the darkness, searching for any sign of Vanessa. The cold air inside was thick with dust and the scent of decay. The moonlight filtering through the broken windows cast long shadows across the floor. She called out, her voice shaking despite her best efforts to sound firm. "Vanessa!" The word felt like a shout into the abyss, swallowed up by the vast emptiness of the warehouse. Her voice cracked on the second syllable, but she steadied herself, taking another step into the space. From the shadows, Vanessa stepped forward, her figure emerging like a ghost from the dark. Her face was calm, unnervingly calm. Her expression was unreadable, but the glint in her eyes was cold, calculating. She was no longer the woman who had pretended to mourn the death of her husband. She was a predator, and Grace Montgomery was her prey. "Grace," Vanessa said softly, her voice smooth, almost too calm. I wasn't sure you'd actually show up. She paused, letting the silence stretch between them. But here you are, just like I knew you would be, a grandmother, trying to protect what's mine. Grace Montgomery felt a chill crawl up her spine. The words were laced with venom, with a twisted sense of entitlement that made her stomach churn. She wanted to scream at her, to lash out, to demand how she could be so heartless, but she knew better. The trap was set, and she had to stay calm. I'm not here for a confrontation, Vanessa, Grace said, her voice steady but firm. I'm here because you have no right to him. You've already tried to take Oliver's life. I won't let you take him again. Vanessa laughed, the sound cold and empty. She stepped closer, her eyes gleaming with something darker than before. You think you've won, don't you? You think you can keep him safe, keep him from me. But it's too late, Grace. He's mine, and I'm taking him back. With those words, Vanessa took a step forward, her hand moving toward her jacket. Grace froze, her heart stopping in her chest. The tension crackled in the air like an electric charge, a moment that seemed to stretch forever. Then, in a blur, Vanessa pulled a gun from her jacket and aimed it directly at Grace. Grace Montgomery's body went cold. The weight of the gun in Vanessa's hand felt like a lead weight pressing on her chest. But even in the face of the weapon, Grace didn't flinch. She wasn't going to back down. She wasn't going to let this woman take Oliver. You'll never take him from me, Grace spat, her voice strong, despite the pounding fear in her veins. The sound of footsteps, heavy, fast, suddenly echoed behind her. The police, in position, sprang into action. Vanessa turned her head just as the flash of lights filled the room. The gun was yanked from her hand before she could react, and within seconds, Vanessa was pinned to the ground, arms twisted behind her, a dozen officers closing in. Vanessa Harris, you are under arrest for the murder of Ethan Montgomery and the attempted murder of Oliver Montgomery, a police officer read, his voice firm, carrying through the room. You have the right to remain silent. Grace Montgomery's knees gave way, and she sank to the ground, overwhelmed by a flood of emotions. She had done it. She had finally brought Vanessa to justice. But even as the officers cuffed her, even as the police took Vanessa away, the sense of relief was bittersweet. Ethan was gone, and the woman who had killed him was now in custody, but it still felt like something was missing. The fight wasn't over yet. Grace Montgomery had won, but the scars of this battle would stay with her forever. She stood up, her hands shaking, and whispered to the empty space around her. Oliver is safe now. He's finally safe. The sterile white walls of the hospital room felt like a confining cage. Each breath Grace Montgomery took reminding her of the gunshot wound that had almost stolen everything from her. The dull ache in her shoulder, where the bullet had grazed her skin, was a constant, lingering reminder of the night's chaotic events. But it was the emotional toll that weighed most heavily on her, deeper, more insidious, as if the pain in her body was nothing compared to the trauma she had endured. She hadn't been able to sleep much since the arrest. Every time she closed her eyes, she could hear Vanessa Harris's voice in her head, cold and chilling, demanding Oliver Montgomery back. Even now, the haunting tone of Vanessa's words lingered, threatening to unravel the fragile sense of peace Grace had fought so hard to build. The physical pain was sharp and real, but the fear that still gripped her chest, the fear that Vanessa might somehow slip through the cracks, was far more suffocating. Grace sat on the edge of the hospital bed, her fingers absently tracing the bandage around her shoulder. The wound wasn't serious, the doctors had said, but it felt like it had taken a piece of her soul along with it. The events of the night replayed in her mind like an endless loop. Vanessa's face, the gun, the fear for Oliver, the trap set, the chaos that had erupted in the warehouse. And yet, despite everything that had happened, despite Vanessa being behind bars, the sense of relief was tempered by something else. Something dark, something that gnawed at her. Grace. Father Michael Davis said softly from the doorway, his familiar voice like a balm to her soul. How are you feeling? Grace looked up at him, her eyes tired, a hollow ache deep within them. Physically, I'll be fine, she replied, forcing a small smile. But, emotionally, I don't think I'll ever be the same. He nodded, walking into the room and taking a seat beside her. I don't think anyone would expect you to be the same after everything that's happened. You've been through hell and back." Grace sighed deeply, her gaze falling to her lap. "Vanessa, she's behind bars. I should be relieved, right? Finally justice for Ethan. But there's this heaviness I can't shake. I keep thinking about what she might do next, what she's capable of. She's been so cunning, so manipulative, and now, knowing she tried to kill Oliver, it's hard to feel like I've truly won." Father Michael looked at her with understanding in his eyes. "It's natural to feel that way. You've been living in fear for so long, and now that fear doesn't just go away overnight. Vanessa's arrest is justice, but that doesn't erase the trauma she caused." Grace nodded, her throat tightening. "I know, I'm just scared. Vanessa was able to lie, to manipulate, to make everyone believe her. What if she finds a way out? What if she tries to go after Oliver again once she gets out? I can't let that happen. I'll do anything to protect him." The weight of the words hung heavily in the air, the truth of what Grace had been through settling deep into her bones. She had fought for Oliver with everything she had, and now, more than ever, he was the only thing that mattered. The reality of what Vanessa had done, the lies, the manipulation, the cruelty, was impossible to digest. Vanessa wasn't just a threat to Grace. She was a threat to Oliver, to everything Grace held dear. The door creaked open again, and Alois walked in, her warm smile a welcome contrast to the tension in the room. Oliver was in her arms, his tiny face pressed against her shoulder, his little hands clutching her blouse. Grace's heart swelled at the sight of him, the tiny life she had fought so hard to protect. Her grandson, her responsibility. "I thought you might want to see him," Alois said softly, walking over to Grace and placing Oliver in her arms. Grace felt the weight of the baby in her arms, the gentle rhythm of his breathing, and for a brief moment all the fear, the anger, the guilt melted away. Here he was, the reason she had done it all, the reason she had kept fighting when everything seemed impossible. He was safe. He was in her arms, alive, thriving, and for now he was free from the nightmare that Vanessa had tried to thrust upon him. Her heart ached with a kind of love she had never known. She looked at Alois, her voice thick with emotion. "I can't believe how much he means to me, after everything. I never imagined I could love someone so deeply again. I would give everything to keep him safe." Alois smiled, a gentle understanding in her eyes. "And you will, Grace. You already have. You've given him a chance, and that's more than most people could ever do. Oliver Montgomery is lucky to have you." Grace Montgomery sat in the silence that followed, her arms wrapped protectively around Oliver, his little body warm against hers. The peaceful, tender moment felt like an anchor in the storm, a reminder of everything she had fought for. And as the weight of her exhaustion began to settle in, she realized something deep inside her. The battle might be over, but the journey was just beginning. Despite everything, despite the trauma, the pain, and the scars that would never fully fade, she had Oliver. And as long as she had him, as long as he was in her arms, she would keep fighting. No matter what. Vanessa might be in prison, but Grace Montgomery knew the fight wasn't over. Oliver Montgomery needed her, and that was all that mattered. The months that followed Vanessa Harris's arrest were a blur of paperwork, meetings, and constant tension. Grace Montgomery had always prided herself on being a woman who could handle adversity, but this was something different. This was a battle not just for Oliver Montgomery's safety, but for his future. His right to grow up in a home filled with love, stability, and the protection he had been denied for so long. Every day felt like another mountain to climb. As the legal system's gears turned slowly, Grace found herself caught in a web of bureaucratic red tape. She spent hours sitting in sterile offices, filling out forms, meeting with lawyers, and enduring interviews with social workers who asked the same questions over and over. How are you adjusting to raising a child at your age? How do you plan to provide for him long-term? Are you physically and emotionally prepared to take care of Oliver in the long run? Each question was another challenge, another reminder of the weight that rested on her shoulders. At 60 years old, raising her grandson was not an easy task, and the system seemed to make it more difficult with every passing day. Every form that came through the door, every scheduled appointment, felt like another hurdle in a race that never seemed to end. And yet, through it all, Grace Montgomery never faltered. She wasn't doing this for herself. She was doing it for Oliver, the baby she had pulled from the lake, the child she now considered her own. There were moments when the stress threatened to break her. The constant evaluations from doctors, the invasive questions from social workers who seemed more focused on checking boxes than understanding her love for Oliver, weighed heavily on Grace. She didn't want to be judged for her age, for her past. She didn't want to feel like she had to prove that she was enough, that she could provide everything Oliver needed. But she knew she had no choice. The legal system was cold, impersonal, and relentless. One afternoon, she sat in a small, sterile office, her hands shaking as she signed another stack of papers. The lawyer across from her, a young, confident woman named Catherine Wells, flipped through the pages with practiced ease, explaining the next steps. "We need a few more references, and there's the home inspection still to complete. After that, we'll need to schedule another round of psychological evaluations, but we're getting close." Grace nodded, though her mind was elsewhere. She couldn't shake the feeling that no matter how many hurdles she jumped through, there was still someone, something, that was going to stand in her way. Vanessa's lawyer, of course, had made it clear that they would fight this every step of the way, trying to discredit Grace's ability to raise Oliver. They knew her age, her grief, and they were using it all against her. Every time she saw Oliver, every time she held him close, the weight of the battle ahead seemed to grow heavier. She had never felt more helpless than in those moments. Unsure if she was doing enough to prove she could be the mother he needed. But as the weeks dragged on, Grace Montgomery's resolve grew stronger. She wouldn't let Oliver fall through the cracks. She couldn't let him suffer the same fate Ethan Montgomery had suffered, caught in the chaos of a toxic relationship, abandoned by the very people who should have loved and protected him. In the evenings, after a long day of meetings, she would retreat into the sanctuary of Oliver's room. The soft hum of the night outside, the gentle rise and fall of his breath as he slept, reminded her of why she was fighting. One evening, as she sat beside Oliver's crib, watching him sleep peacefully, the doorbell rang, jolting her from her thoughts. Catherine Wells stood at the door with a folder in her hand, her face tight with the stress of the ongoing case. "We've got another hurdle," Catherine said, stepping inside. "The judge has requested additional documentation. They want more evidence of your ability to provide financially for Oliver. You'll need to gather tax returns from the past 5 years, and they want you to prove that your pension is enough to cover the costs of raising him." Grace felt the familiar knot in her stomach tighten. It wasn't that she wasn't capable of providing for Oliver. She had savings, a modest pension, and a lifetime of experience in providing for a family. But in the eyes of the law, it wasn't enough. Nothing ever felt like enough. "I'll get it," Grace said, her voice tired but determined. "I'll do whatever it takes." As Catherine left, Grace sank into a chair, her heart heavy. But she didn't cry. She couldn't afford to. She still had work to do. She still had to fight for Oliver. Over the next few weeks, the burden of the legal battle intensified. Grace Montgomery spent hours at the bank, gathering financial documents. She met with more doctors and social workers. Each interaction was a reminder of the monumental challenge she faced. And yet, as she navigated each obstacle, something inside her hardened. The love she felt for Oliver gave her the strength to face whatever came next. The process felt endless, each evaluation, each document, each form making her feel smaller and smaller. But Grace was unshaken. She had already lost one son. She wasn't going to lose Oliver. Despite the exhaustion, despite the mounting pressure, Grace Montgomery was not backing down. She would stand tall for Oliver. She would continue to jump through the hoops, cross the lines, and fight the bureaucratic system until the day she could look at that judge and say, "Oliver is mine. I am his family." And that was the one thing Grace knew she could never let anyone take from her. The courtroom was filled with a heavy silence, the kind that presses against your chest, making it hard to breathe. Grace Montgomery sat at the defendant's table, her hands folded tightly in her lap, the only outward sign of her anxiety. The cold, sterile air seemed to magnify the pounding of her heart, each beat a reminder of the momentous decision that was about to unfold. Her eyes flickered nervously from the judge to Catherine Wells, her lawyer, who sat beside her, shuffling through the final documents for the case. Every inch of the room felt suffocating, too still, too quiet. Grace glanced at Oliver Montgomery, who was sitting on Aloysius' lap in the back row. His small face was peaceful, his eyes half closed as if the weight of the room didn't burden him at all. He was so young, so innocent, so unaware of the fierce battle that had been waged for his future. He was her world now. She would do whatever it took to protect him. Grace's mind swirled with all the months of hardship, the long hours spent in meetings with social workers, the constant evaluations, the paperwork that felt endless. She had fought every step of the way for Oliver. And now, after all the hurdles, the endless questioning, and the invasive legal processes, the moment of judgment had arrived. She tried to steady her breathing, tried to focus on the judge's stern face as he reviewed the final documents. Judge Emily Ward had been professional throughout the case, but Grace couldn't help but notice the slight weariness in her eyes. She knew this had been a difficult case for everyone involved. The minutes ticked by like hours. Grace's mind wandered back to the first time she had held Oliver in her arms, the terror and the love that had flooded her as she pulled him from that suitcase by the lake. That moment had changed everything. He had become hers in that instant, but today it would become official. Judge Ward cleared her throat and looked up from the papers. The entire room seemed to hold its breath. Grace squeezed her hands tighter, trying to steady the storm raging inside her. Her thoughts were a blur, a mix of fear, hope, and the kind of anticipation that makes it impossible to sit still. She turned her gaze toward Oliver, meeting his sleepy, trusting eyes, and in that moment, everything outside of that courtroom, the case, the legal battles, the fear of losing him faded away. It was just him. Her grandson, the only thing that mattered. Grace Montgomery, the judge began, her voice cutting through the tension in the room. I have reviewed the documents and the testimony presented in this case. The social workers have submitted their reports, and the evaluations have been completed. Based on all the evidence, it is clear that Oliver Montgomery is in a stable and loving home. The court recognizes your dedication and your ability to provide a safe environment for him. Grace's breath caught in her throat. Was this it? Was it finally happening? She watched as Judge Ward flipped through the final pages, her expression unreadable. Grace's fingers clenched into fists at her sides, and for a moment she thought she might collapse under the pressure. But she stayed rooted in her seat, her body still but her heart racing with hope and fear, all tangled together. After what felt like an eternity, Judge Ward finally looked up, her eyes meeting Grace. It is the judgment of this court that Grace Montgomery be granted permanent custody of Oliver Montgomery. Furthermore, the court grants Grace Montgomery the legal right to adopt Oliver Montgomery, effective immediately. The words hit Grace like a wave, crashing over her and sweeping her into a whirlwind of emotions. Her vision blurred as tears sprang to her eyes, and she covered her mouth, trying to stifle the sob that was rising from deep within her chest. She had done it. Oliver was hers, legally, officially, forever. The room seemed to dissolve around her. She heard a sound, a soft exhale from Catherine Wells, a congratulatory murmur from the people around her, but all of it felt distant, almost unreal. Grace stood slowly, feeling her legs go weak beneath her. The weight of the moment finally crashed down on her, but it was not the crushing weight of fear or anxiety. It was the weight of relief, of joy, of love. Oliver was safe. He would never have to go back to the life that had almost destroyed him. She turned to see Aloysius, holding Oliver in her arms, her face bright with the same emotion that was flooding Grace's chest. Grace crossed the room quickly, as if drawn by some magnetic force, and when she reached Oliver, she scooped him up, holding him close against her heart. He was her everything. He was the one thing she had left of her son, the one thing she could protect. Oliver, Grace whispered, her voice breaking. You're mine. I promise you no one will ever take you from me. The tears came freely now, the weight of the entire ordeal falling away. She could hardly believe it. Oliver was hers, legally and forever. No more fighting, no more uncertainty. The nightmare that had plagued her for so long had finally ended. As she held him close, Grace Montgomery realized just how much had changed in the past months. She had fought not just for Oliver's custody, but for a new beginning for both of them. And now, as she looked at the little face in her arms, she knew that the journey they had started together, one filled with love, hope, and healing, was only just beginning. The future was uncertain, but Grace was ready for it. She would protect Oliver Montgomery with everything she had, and no matter what came next, she would face it with him by her side. Because he was hers, and she was his. Forever. The house, once filled with the echoes of grief and loss, now hummed with the quiet rhythm of a new life. Grace Montgomery stood in the kitchen, preparing dinner, her hands moving with ease as the scent of roasted chicken and vegetables filled the air. It was a simple meal, one she had made countless times before, but today it felt different. There was a warmth in the air, a sense of peace that had been missing for so long. In the living room, Oliver Montgomery was toddling around, his tiny hands gripping the edges of the coffee table as he took his first unsteady steps. Grace watched from the doorway, her heart swelling with pride. She could hardly believe how quickly he was growing, how fast the days had passed since the day she had pulled him from the lake. Every milestone, every new word, every tiny achievement filled her with a joy she had thought was lost to her forever. "Come here, little one," Grace called softly, her voice warm and full of love. Oliver turned, his bright eyes locking with hers as a grin spread across his face. He took a step forward, then another, his movements slow but determined. When he finally reached her, she scooped him up into her arms, laughing as he giggled, his tiny hands clinging to her. "You're getting so big," she murmured, pressing a kiss to his soft cheek. Her heart swelled with a deep, indescribable love. The kind of love only a grandmother could feel, a love that had been earned through sacrifice, through struggle, through the quiet moments of bonding that built a life together. As they sat down for their first family meal together, Grace smiled across the table at Oliver, his eyes wide as he eagerly grabbed at his plate of mashed potatoes. Alois, who had become not just a caregiver but a friend, sat beside them, sharing in the simple joy of the evening. There was laughter and chatter, stories about the past, about Grace's days raising her own children, about the small victories that had led them here. It felt like a family again, a family that had been rebuilt piece by piece. The challenges, of course, were not gone. Grace Montgomery was still adjusting to the new rhythm of life with a child in her care. Her body ached more than it ever had, and there were nights when sleep eluded her, when the weight of the responsibility pressed down so hard that she wondered if she could continue. But then she would look at Oliver, look into his wide, trusting eyes, and the doubt would fade away. Every day was a lesson in patience, in understanding, in the quiet art of giving. Grace had learned that being a grandmother didn't mean she had to be perfect. It meant that she had to be present, really present, for Oliver, to show him love, to guide him, to provide him with the stability and safety that had been robbed from him in his early years. There were days when Grace would sit on the porch, watching the sunset, and think about all that had happened, the grief of losing her son, the battle to keep Oliver, the long road to adoption. She thought about Ethan Montgomery, her son, and the choices he had made. She wished he could be here to see Oliver growing up, to see the family they had become. But in some quiet, spiritual way, Grace felt like he was with them. She felt his presence in the gentle way Oliver smiled at her, in the soft way he would reach out for her hand when he needed comfort. And in those moments, Grace found peace. The world had changed for her in ways she never expected, and the path she had walked was filled with heartbreak and loss. But there was also a new beginning, a beginning built on love, sacrifice, and the quiet, unspoken bond that now connected her and Oliver Montgomery. Grace Montgomery sat in the soft glow of the lamp, Oliver nestled in her arms as he drifted to sleep. She thought about the future, the milestones still to come, the challenges that would inevitably arise. But she no longer feared what lay ahead, because she had Oliver now, and together they would face whatever the world had to offer. The love that filled their home was enough to light the darkest of days. "Oliver," Grace whispered softly, her voice filled with the kind of love that could move mountains, "I will protect you forever, and no matter what happens, we will always have each other." She closed her eyes, resting her cheek against his soft hair, and for the first time in a long time, she felt whole. Grace Montgomery had lost much in her life, but she had gained something even greater in return. A new beginning, a second chance at love, and the joy of watching Oliver grow into the boy he was always meant to be. And in that moment, Surrounded by the quiet peace of the evening, Grace Montgomery knew that she had found her way home.